I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and welcome to night 3 of the 2023 ChemKnits Chanukah special, where every night I will be dyeing some more yarn, a new colorway, using different techniques, and it's a lot of fun. Tonight, we are going to make a yarn lasagna. I know that sounds weird, but stay with me. This is a technique that I like to do to create variegated yarn, where in one pan, I layer yarn, dye, then more yarn and more dye and more yarn and more dye, so that way I can fit a lot more yarn in one pan to heat set it all together. Now, the term yarn lasagna, that evolved in last year's live chat when I did this technique for the very first time. So if you're in the live chat right now watching this premiere, who knows what inspiration I'm going to be drawing from whatever we talk about. You never know what's going to stick. And if you're watching this on demand later, feel free to leave comments and suggestions on the video. I do keep track of suggestions and draw from them frequently when I'm creating new videos. As for the why I like to do this lasagna technique, and I have a feeling that this might be something that is a little bit particular to me or maybe some other small batch dyers. I'll talk about that more in a little bit, but for now, let's go jump into our project. This year's Chanukah is all about chasing joy, and I'm pulling things that gave me huge excitement or pride from the last year or so. And one of those was the November 2022 ChemKnits Dye-Along, which was a beautiful sunset photo. I was full of excitement for a trip to Hawaii, a belated 10-year anniversary trip we were taking with some of our best friends. We all got married around the same time. Super, super exciting. And I was bubbling with excitement. And so creating this sort of sunset-y gradient, I wanted to not do exactly that colorway, but something similar with our lasagna technique. And so the colors we're going to use for our lasagna today are a combination of honey mustard, deep magenta, and electric violet. These are two of the colors that I used in the original, and I believe I mixed my own orange out of deep magenta and brilliant yellow last time, but I picked a more golden yellow that we can layer with the pink and make some more red to orange tones. We'll see how things sort of play together in the pan. Now, I'm okay with layer and mixing. I think the blends of these colors will be very, very beautiful. One difference between this palette and some of the other lasagna palettes that I've done in the past is that I tend to go for like a bright, medium, and deep color when I'm doing a lasagna, and so I wanted to create something that I suppose electric violet, you could consider it deep, but it is still a bright color. And so I wanted to have more of just the bright elements in here today. I suppose if I wanted to do a 4-color lasagna, I could have picked sort of like a midnight color to use like at the end to keep things like super deep. But I decided, at least with the first pan, to stick with these 3 colors. Who knows if I will go through and add maybe when I go through the second pan. That's right, first pan and second pan. In these Chanukah videos, I am dyeing at least 1,300 grams of yarn, 13 skeins. And normally I dye 300 grams of yarn max in a pan at a time. So that leads to multiple pans. But tonight, I'm going to be dyeing all this yarn in just 2. Because with this technique, I can fit 800 grams of yarn in one pan easily. Now, if I was trying to do this all at once, it would be hard to get good coverage on all the yarn. But because we're layering the dye in the yarn, I'm able to get good coverage of dye everywhere. The reason why I like to do this is that it means I can process the yarn a little bit faster. I have limited heat sources in my kitchen. I have space for 2 of these steam pans on my stove, and actually I only have 2 of these steam pans still. And so this allows me to go and heat set a lot more of this yarn at once versus heating one batch for 30 minutes, letting it cool, washing the pan, and starting fresh. Now, if I were an indie dyer with a steam cupboard and had the ability to heat dozens of pans at a time, this technique doesn't make sense for you to try because you have the ability to heat set a lot of yarn all at once. You may as well set things up in their individual pans. But for me, this works great and really helps with my process. This is my 4-inch deep full-size catering steam pan. It's one of the same ones I've been using for years. And I'm bringing 200 grams of yarn in for the first layer. The yarn we're using today is Platinum Sock and Platinum DK. All of the yarn is 75% superwash merino wool, 25% nylon. And I pre-soaked them for a couple of days. And I didn't wring out all the water when I brought it over, but I'm gonna add just a tiny bit of some plain tap water, no acid, to our yarn before we start this first layer. Now, eventually, I'm gonna want to add more water for this layer, but because we're doing the bottom layer first, I can add the dye on, then we can flip the yarn and add more dye to the other side before sort of continuing. And so that's why I have things set up like this, but we want to be able to sort of squish the dye through. If you want to learn more about any of the tools or equipment that I'm using for these videos, I do have links and affiliate links down in the video description. But now I'm going to go put on my deluxe rubber respirator mask that has P100 filters, safety glasses, and gloves, and we're going to start applying the dye. And I do have a skein of Swish worsted 100% superwash merino yarn mop off camera, and I'll use this to wipe my hands on as needed as we're prepping all of these colors. And this also has no acid in it, so that way I don't end up with some acid on my gloves and transfer that onto the yarn. We want to be able to spread these colors out for now. We're gonna start with the lightest slash brightest color, which today is our honey mustard. And I'm going to take this and spread it over, I guess, approximately a third of the yarn. I don't want to do too much. I looked at Golden Poppy, and you can see some of the color is spreading down. Things aren't, all of the minis won't be exactly the same. I considered Golden Poppy, but I'm glad I went for this color because it is sufficiently golden yellow slash orange, and I think that things would have started a little bit too orange already if I had gone straight for, I'm trying to mix that little bit in, the Golden Poppy. There is, a little bit of brightness to it, but I am happy. Now, I do need to dry my gloves before going into the next color. And you can see we're getting some spread, but that is good. There are some colors that work super, super well for a lasagna technique. And then there are colors that don't work quite as well. And this all comes down to colors that strike fast to our yarn versus colors that have a little bit of time to spread out. And so if our colors strike too quickly, then we don't get a chance to work it through the yarn. And ooh, look at those oranges we're getting as those colors combine. And so that'll just make the color patchier and just a little bit more challenging to work with. But oh, this is pretty. I think this is one of the first colors where, or one of the first lasagna colors where we will be able to get some interesting colors at the blend versus just having like one color sort of dominate the other. Like if we have like a foam and a sea foam or something with a navy, like the navy would take over. But I'm liking this already. Electric violet. Now this container is running low. I do have another jar of electric violet. So we have plenty of it. And I'm curious about how deep versus bright this is going to feel. Like electric violet is a very bright purple, but also a very violet purple, which is great. One difference between doing this technique on Miniskeins like I have here versus full skeins is that there is less, quote, inside of the skein just from the way it is tied up. And so I find it a little bit easier to get good coverage on the yarn. But this is our first layer, and as I said, I want to flip the yarn over. We may want to pump up the volume on our yarn a little bit. Oh dear. But you can see we're getting actually pretty good coverage overall. I need to make sure, as I am doing this, to sort of work my way down this way and wipe my gloves. Okay, so we can expose our yarn. Now, we could have 300 grams of yarn across, but the reason why I do this with 200 grams is because you can see that I can spread the yarn out more and it has the layers thinner. If the layer is thicker, then you'll see more pastel patches as we go through. But historically, this technique ends up with really good coverage. And so we're adding more dye, and then the goal isn't to get speckles. I am layering I'm going to keep saying golden poppy even though that is incorrect, the honey mustard over the pink a little bit more because I like those orange tones. The goal isn't to speckle, but it's, again, to spread out these colors. It's to spread it and to get them to dissolve easily, because you don't want to have any big clumps, because any massive clumps of the color just won't remain sort of the way we wanted it to remain. And so the nice thing with this honey mustard color is that it is so dark as a powder that you can find the areas that haven't dissolved and really work that through. And after each color, I'm wiping my hands on the yarn mop and then drying them. Now, the original version of this colorway that I dyed it as a dip dyed colorway. And so I had a lot of control over these intermediate colors, because as you're dipping, you can sort of decide, okay, that's enough color. I'm going to stop. I'm going to bring in a yarn mop and let that be the color and let that be done. And so here, yes, I have control, but when you're dip dyeing, you can sort of decide, okay, that's enough. I'm done. I don't want to add any more color on. And once I have added the dye on, it's harder to remove that. However, because we're going to be adding yarn on top, it doesn't quite give us the opportunity to remove yarn, but it does give us a little bit more flexibility as we're playing with this. But I'll say all of these colors are doing really good things. They're behaving really well. They're not striking too fast. And there's enough pigmentation that it's just working. I will probably need to get the other jar of electric violet, but I think I already brought that downstairs. Unfortunately, it's one of my favorite colors, but it is also one of the most expensive colors in Dharma Acid Dyes collection. And I think that's because I believe Dharma charges based on like the cost of the pigments in their dyes. So their premixed pastels are cheaper than some of the like deeper, more saturated colors. And I think unfortunately there is a pigment in the purple that is more expensive. So unlike what we've done so far, and I am just sort of checking. See, we can sort of press the yarn on top of each other, but I don't want to lift everything again because I don't want the yarn to sort of move, or I don't want the dyes to move through, but we're getting good coverage, so I don't remember what I was saying. All right, I'm going to add just a little bit of water. Before we start our second layer. And this could allow to some like spreading and wicking, and that's okay. But there's one other thing I want to do before putting the second layer of yarn on. And that is going to be to add some color on here for the bottom side of the next colorway. So I am quickly going to speckle in, do some
On the interface, our honey mustard. Wiping my fingers on the yarn mop, which is now getting a lot more color. Okay, next is the deep magenta. Because some of this dye that is already there will come up onto the next layer, but it's nice to just have a little bit of powder there because for some reason the powders move better than the liquids.
I need to switch to a voiceover here because my dog was barking a lot and it was unlistenable. I'm working quickly, adding on the electric violet, and then moving to remove that excess dye from my hands to bring over the next layer of yarn because I don't want to let the dry dye powder sit on the yarn too long because we're not trying to get speckles here. And even though we're able to dissolve the dye and spread it out, if I leave the powder too long on any one section, we're going to get more pigment in that section. One perk of working with these Miniskeins in the steam pans is that the Miniskeins are a little bit shorter, so laying on the next layer is pretty easy. I don't have to scrunch up the yarn very much at all to get that layer on.
Okay, and without taking much of a break, I want to quickly start moving this color from our first layer through. And you'll see that it's mostly a lot lighter, but we are getting color through. Oh, one of these days, you know what I still need to do? I still need to do this and try to do a fade like this intentionally where I don't add more dye on each layer. Like maybe I do in that first one, but then I carry on. I forgot about that. Okay. See, I'll go and pay some attention to my dog before we add more dye, but we're about to be starting a time lapse anyway. Okay, the colors aren't quite pushed all the way through, but I'm now going to add a lot more water because the water in here is key, because if we don't have enough liquid, then it's a lot harder to move and dissolve the dye and mix it through the yarn. And yes, even without additional acid, some amount of colors are going to strike to our yarn now. But you could see now with more water in here, it is so much easier for me to move that little bit of color through. And then when it comes to the purples, some of these areas in the zip ties, it was hard to get color in there. But you can see that we do have dye, plenty of dye. And so with this more liquid, it's easier to move the colors just through and to get more coverage. Because ultimately, it's that coverage that we really want and need here. We've only done 1.5 layers so far. This is the status of our yarn mop. I'm going to get a second yarn mop to start building on, but I have a feeling I'm going to layer more color on this with pan 2. I'm just going to want to add some acid and heat set at some point. We will see. But yeah, we're going to carry on.
So lather, rinse, repeat, or really layer, press, repeat. I added more dye, worked it through the yarn for each of the 3 colors, layering the colors a bit at the interface, and then before adding on the 3rd layer of yarn, I added some more dry dye powder on top, put the yarn on, pressed that through, layered dye, and continued. And I don't know how key it is to add some dry powder onto the yarn before adding on the next layer, but certainly it doesn't hurt, because you know that then when you're pressing it through, there's some dye that has not dissolved yet, and so you're both going to get that through onto your new colorway of yarn, but you also might be working some more color onto the layer that was beneath it, and that's not a bad thing either. And then with each of the layers, it's also, again, important to add more water. Now, one concern is that as you're adding water, conceivably you could be blending everything together on that bottom layer, but I really haven't had that happen. I'm sure there's pigments where that could happen, but every time I've done this, I've been able to maintain except for maybe on a middle or a top if I add different colors on each layer. But with a single, using the same colorway for each layer, it's worked out okay for me. And so I'm fairly optimistic that this is going to continue to work out reasonably and that we'll continue to get these colors.
I am now going to add some acid. We're going to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 tablespoons of white vinegar. I totally poured vinegar all over my counter and floor when I was aliquoting it out, but that is okay. All right, and now I'm pushing on the yarn again to try to work the acid through a bit, but I'm also going to leave the yarn on the counter for a little while, just to let it sit before bringing it to the heat, because I don't want gravity as I lift the pan and maybe tilt it to move things very much. So, you know, that's nerve-wracking. And I'm going to want to be able to add more water. So I'm going to set a timer, and I'm going to let this sit for 15 minutes. And as for our yarn mops over here, I'm going to bring over 1, 2 tablespoons of white vinegar, tiny bit of some liquid, and we're going to gently squish it. And the nice thing is that the color is relatively, I mean, it's definitely not completely, but is relatively clear. I mean, there's a little bit of some color moving, but what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go and just stick it in a steamer basket for the rest of the 15 minutes. It's not even on camera all the way, just so that way we can start setting this color a little bit. But then we'll layer more color onto those same yarn mops with our next round. Okay, I'm curious. Yeah, I'm still seeing a fair amount of color in our yarn. I don't have the yarn mops back over yet. We're gonna add just like another 2 cups of water, just because I want things to not be too compressed, because I have not yet squished yarn and I don't want today to be the day. Okay, so I didn't quite add all of that. I added enough until I'm like, okay, I'm seeing the water at the surface. I am sort of plumping things up. Yeah, okay, I can add that last little bit. That'll be fine. And I'm going to very carefully carry this to the stove, and I'm going to immediately turn on the heat, and then I'll bring you over. We are on the stove. I temporarily have the heat on high. There's 2 burners here and here, but I will be turning down the heat. And the other thing I'm going to want to do, because this is so crowded, I'm going to want to cover it. And I'm bringing over just a layer of tin foil. Is it long enough? Just about. Oh man. Okay, the goal, it's not covered perfectly. And I'm going to reduce the heat to medium. Eventually I'll send it to low. The goal is just to try to trap a bunch of the steam in there. But I'm going to be heating this and setting my timer in 10-minute increments. And I'm going to come and check in on the yarn frequently to make sure that it is not too hot and not too dry. But I want to make sure that everything in here heats for at least 30 minutes. Probably even longer. So yeah, we'll be back after it's been nice and steamy for 30 minutes. You know what? Okay, it's against my better judgment. I'm gonna get a bigger piece of foil. Of course, this time I went way too big. But there we go. It let me sort of get it over on the edge a little bit better. It'll be easier. It's gonna trap a little bit more steam. It's good. It's good. All right. But as I said, off camera, I'll check in periodically, and we'll start adding some water with acid if I think we need it. But I'll talk about that at a check-in. Okay, I'm reducing the heat to low.
we are good and steamy. And the nice thing is that we see a really good water level everywhere, but there's no harm in adding some more water. This is some of that water plus vinegar that I had mentioned. And things, again, we see plenty of water around the edges, around the middle. I just don't want things on the bottom to be too compressed. That is the concern. But adding a little bit, things look good. So, it had been 15 minutes. I'm gonna go ahead and I'll be checking in on it, but we're gonna heat this for another 30 minutes from here, just because there's a lot of yarn and I wanna make sure the middle is heated through. And then, well, then I'll chat with you. In the meantime, I off camera removed the yarn mops and set them aside to cool a little bit so I could comfortably wipe my gloves on them, and started a second lasagna. Now I only have 500 grams of Miniskeins left, so that's enough for 2.5 layers. I decided to add 1 full skein into the mix, and when I add that on at the end, you'll see that it's a lot longer. I have to scrunch it more to get it to fit. But just that way I can have a complete third layer and I don't need to worry that I'm adding too much or too little color for that final round. But the main thing was that I layered yarn and dye, yarn and dye, yarn and dye. And again, I sort of want to reiterate that this overall technique is only more efficient because I have limited sources of heat. I have 4 burners on my stove and I have 1 double burner electric hot plate. So even if I had 3 catering steam pans, I would be able to do 3 pans at once, heat, let the yarn cool completely, and that's all I can do in them in a day. But if I can layer 800 grams in each of those pans, then suddenly I can do 24 skeins. And it's the same amount of time on the heat source. And so the efficiency isn't for the dyeing time. If I had 12 steam pans, I could do the layering of dye and moving it all around 2 skeins or 3 skeins maybe at a time per pan. And that would be a similar rate of doing it. It's just because I'm limited in the heat source. And this is what allows me to process the yarn a lot faster. And I absolutely adore it. Now, one reason why I am doing this with dry dye powders instead of liquid dyes is that I am closely controlling the amount of liquid that I add into the pan at any time. And by adding dry dye powder, I'm able to dissolve it in a very small space where I want it to be. If I was using liquid dyes and I wanted to add a lot more color, each time I'm adding more color, I'm adding more water, which means that things might blend together more than what I want. And so that's just something to keep in mind. Now, one doubt I have for today's whole project is maybe I didn't squish the colors through the yarn enough. So I don't know if we'll end up with some white patches this time. But either way, I love the colors, I love the yarn, and well, I'm excited to see how everything is gonna turn out. Once I was done adding the color here, off camera, I took it to the stove and I heat it and let it be hot and steamy for at least 30 minutes, and then I let it cool down completely overnight so that way we could wash the yarn. Well, remove the layers and wash the yarn. Okay, after 30 minutes of heat, well, I turned off the heat a tiny bit ago, and we are very steamy. Let's see. Okay, that's looking clear. That's looking clear. Woohoo! Looking clear all around. All right, but I'm gonna go ahead and leave the yarn in the pan to cool, just because that's what's easiest. And then we'll go ahead and wash this tomorrow. It is the next day, everything is cool, and so now we can remove the yarn from our lasagna. And let's look at the top layer. But actually, first, and because with the light that I have here, this is just a light that I have over my stove, things look a little bit overexposed, but you can still feel some of the blend in the color. And it's really, really pretty. All right, let's lift up. Because if things are scrunched, then in theory, things could go between like purple to pink and back to purple in some of the layers. This coverage looks amazing though. Oh, this is so pretty. I still have in my brain, and I'm wanting editing Rebecca, she didn't write this down already, but I want to do this again, even if it's not a lasagna, even if it's just the colorway with a navy at this end. Okay, but that was the second layer. I'm not seeing any white patches. And the colors layer to layer are fairly consistent. We still have the yellow. I'm sure there will be some that have different lengths of the yellow. Like here, there's some orange that goes more towards the end. But that is something that would happen if I was dyeing things in separate pans. And if anything, I'm able to have slightly more consistency over where the transitions happen because I'm doing it all in one pan. All right, this is the first layer. Okay, I'm seeing a little bit more darkness in between the pink and purple, which is, oh, and look at this red. Ooh, so this one might have a little bit more blending than some of the other layers. I'm not going to be able to keep all of the yarn separate through the washing, so we won't know, oh, this was layer 1 of pan 1 or anything. But it's so pretty, and you'll see when I go and take everything out of the second pan that there's just a wonderful consistency to this, and it's great because I think one other benefit is because everything is all layered in one pan, as I'm working the dye through like layer 2 or layer 3, I'm also moving things through the layers that are beneath it. And so even if more dye isn't going down, it's helping even things out. And so it's just more opportunity for coverage and for evenness. And I mean, this is like the least patchy. And by patchy, I mean the least number of pale, undyed spots that I ever get. So I'm thrilled. But anyway, let's go wash the yarn. All right, here we go. And I'm gonna shift the zip ties down just a tiny bit. And I always try to make sure to super saturate the zip ties as I'm starting to wash our yarn. Because, especially when we're dealing with dry dye powder, there could be some dye still on the zip ties and we just want it to dissolve and rinse off. But I also always wash in cool tap water, and we're seeing exactly what we want to see, which is no bleeding at all. So I'm now going to go ahead and rinse out the soap from our yarn, and I'm going to wash the rest of the yarn off camera, including our yarn knots. And then we'll come back and see what the finished dry yarn looks like. Here is all of the lasagna yarn, and there is a remarkable amount of consistency in our colorways here. But there are some differences. Like over here, these skeins seem to be deeper pink. This one is a little bit lighter, and so isn't quite as deep. The amount of orange on top of our, what was it, mustard? I filmed this only a couple days ago, so now I'm already forget. The amount of orange up here does vary. And I would say the deepness of the purples can vary a little bit too, but the coverage overall of all the colors is so good. So a little bit in here, you can see an area that goes to pink and then a tiny bit of purple and then more pink again. Likely because the way that the yarn is folded when it goes on the previous layer. But oh my gosh, overall this all turned out so well. Now I do have one full skein of this colorway, and let me readjust the camera. I mean, the consistency is pretty good. All the sections are a little bit bigger, but mostly the pink and the purple. And you can see that like on one part the purple is longer. There's some variation in there just because in order to have these the same size, I did have to scrunch up this yarn a bit, but it worked super well. The yarn mops we ended up with are super pretty. All of the colors, especially that yellow, are a bit more muted because the color is layered on top of one another, but it doesn't feel muddy or anything. But either of these yarn mops, I mean, they're very, very similar. They would pair well with our main variegated colorway, even though this is a lot more random. And so I'm not sure how well they might necessarily like fade together, but I could see using these with maybe coming up with a couple different colors and having it work well all together. This is just such a pretty shot right here. It makes me so happy. But now I need to go twist everything up. As I'm twisting things up, there's something else I want to point out. In this yarn, we do have some blending of colors at the intersection. Like our golden yellow gets a little bit more orange in the middle, and we get a little bit more of this combination of the pink and purple. And even twisted, you can see a little bit of that orange. However, there's not nearly as much blending of color as there would be if the colors spread a lot from one section to another. Things stayed pretty much where we put them. But also if I were to dip dye or something, we would have been able to blend and get a little bit more intermediate color. Because there was only a small section where I was literally layering the colors on top of each other, that gave us these pretty narrow, I mean, it's only about like 1 inch thick for both of the transitions from pink to the other colors. And so that is so narrow just because of the way that this technique ended up working out. And if you think about it, it's pretty incredible that the colors did not spread more through all of the pushing and moving the colors through that we did here. Here's a handful of the minis twisted up. And I did notice one major, well, minor oops. Notice this little yellow strand kind of going down into the pink area. I think there was just one strand that was flipped when I put it in the pan, and so one of the yellow sections in this skein is going to be extra long. So I would say consider yourself lucky if you got that one, and if you got that one, let me know and send me a picture, because I'm really curious how this one will knit up. I adore the lasagna technique, and I'm excited, and I want to know what other kinds of colorways I should do, because as fun as it is to do like different colors on every layer and get the surprise of what happens, it's really magical for me to see a consistency I can achieve painting yarn with dry powder in this layered technique. I talked briefly about how dyeing the full skein was different from the mini skeins just because of the length of the skein, but the length of the skein and therefore the difference in size of the repeats means that it will knit up differently, even though they're, quote, the same colorway, just because the repeats are different, so then the stitches that would result in pooling are also going to be different. And so when you're prototyping something on mini skeins and want to knit a swatch of that, it's important to just keep in mind if the full skeins you're going to be dyeing are the same size. And if they're not, then maybe you want to rewind your mini skein so it is the same size. So that way when you're prototyping a variegated colorway, you can treat the minis the same way you would treat a full skein. But in general, a variegated colorway like this, if I was going to prototype it, I would probably dye it on full skeins versus minis. But we're dyeing the minis for the sampler, and certainly you can reskein your yarn to get any size skein you want. And a lot of dyers will actually buy cones of yarn so they can create their own custom size skeins. And so there's lots of options there, but I just wanted to make sure to point this out. Be honest, what do you think of this technique? I know it isn't for everyone, but it really does work well for me. Similar to how sometimes I choose to do a cold process dyeing because then I can heat set things in larger batches later on. The heating process often is the limiting factor in my dyeing kitchen, and so doing this just helps me create more variegated yarn. And plus, I do think something about the process of working the dye through all of the layers helps me get good coverage on all of the yarn, better than if I was just doing one layer and sticking with that. So whatever it is, it works for me, and therefore I love it. It might not be the best if you want precision with variegated yarn and say you want to dye a sweater's quantity. Maybe I would go for something else, but it certainly is satisfying to watch, right? I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss a new video. Outside of Chanukah, I post videos about twice a week, and we have unboxings and live streams and all kinds of stuff along the way, so if your notifications are on, you're more likely to know when something live is coming up or when I release a video on demand. And if you're looking for other ways to help support the content here, I do have a Patreon, I have an Etsy shop, ChemKnits Creations, but you can also join to become a channel member and get some fun ChemKnits emotes and badges that you can use in the comments and in live chat. It is just a little bit of silly fun, and sometimes I have to use the indie barking emoji a little too much. But I enjoy having it. And it's just another way that you can help support all of the content here. But now it is time for me to say goodnight and for you to start thinking about what might be coming up for Chanukah night 4. I will see you all tomorrow night. Thank you so much for watching.